They thought she was just a waitress. They thought she poured blood wine and kept her eyes down and knew nothing. But when Melis Corwin served King Valar Sanguiner on the night he would sign away his sovereignty, she didn't just pour a drink. She spoke 5 words in a language that had been dead for 4 centuries, words that should have gotten her executed on the spot. Instead, she saved an immortal king from a betrayal older than empires. And in the Night Dominion, that makes you more dangerous than any assassin, because the throne remembers, and it never forgives. The drip of crimson light from the chandeliers in the high blood hall was the heartbeat of the vampire court. It was a rhythm Melis Corwin knew better than her own pulse. The hall wasn't just a throne room. It was a stage where immortals performed the theater of civilization, pretending they weren't always eternally hungry. Thank you for joining me in the shadows of the Night Dominion today. If you're ready to witness a waitress break 4 centuries of silence and save an immortal king with 5 forbidden words, then settle in, because this story doesn't let go. And if you love tales of hidden power, dangerous truths, and servants who become legends, hit that subscribe button now. Drop a comment telling me where you're listening from and whether you dare speak truth to a vampire king. Because tomorrow, I'll have another story that will stop your heart, and you won't want to miss it. Now, let's begin with a girl who thought she was invisible until she spoke the language that could unmake empires. Melis adjusted the lace collar of her serving uniform, catching her reflection in the polished obsidian columns. At 23, she had learned to make herself smaller than she was. She pulled her dark hair into a severe knot at the base of her skull. She wore no adornments. She kept her gaze on the marble floors, tracing the veins of stone rather than meeting the eyes of nobles who could drain her before she drew breath to scream. Table 7 needs refilling. Corvain, the head steward, materialized at her elbow like smoke. He was a brittle man who smelled of ancient parchment and fear. The covenant ceremony begins in minutes. Do not speak. Do not pause. Do not exist beyond your hands and the wine. Am I understood? Yes, Master Corvain, Melis said, her voice a practiced whisper of submission. She needed this position. The servants' quarters beneath the palace were the only shelter she'd known since her grandmother died. The coin she earned kept her from the blood farms where humans were bred and bled. One mistake, one moment of visibility, and she would vanish into the machinery of feeding that sustained the Night Dominion. Nobody in the palace knew that Melis wasn't just a waitress. They didn't know that before Ysilda Corwin had died in a windowless room that smelled of sage and secrets, she had taught her granddaughter the ancient blood tongue, the ritual language of the first vampire purges, outlawed after the keepers were executed and their texts burned. They certainly didn't know that every syllable Melis overheard, every ceremonial phrase murmured in the corridors, was filed away in a mind trained to recognize the grammar of power and domination. Tonight, the air in the hall felt different, heavier, electric with the weight of history bending. At precisely the 9th bell of evening, the atmosphere shattered. The court fell silent as death. The massive doors of black iron and carved bone swung inward. King Valar Sanguiner entered. He didn't walk. He altered space. 7 feet of controlled lethality wrapped in midnight velvet and silver thread. His face was all sharp edges and shadows, with eyes the color of fresh blood under moonlight. Beautiful in the way a blade is beautiful, promising precision if you got too close. He was ancient beyond mortal comprehension, the immortal sovereign of the Night Dominion, and a creature who had forgotten more about cruelty than most would ever learn. Behind him moved 4 Bloodguard warriors who looked like they'd been carved from stone and taught to kill before they learned to breathe. But beside Valar walked the man who made Melis's heart seize in recognition. Archlord Threxian Morn. Threxian was elegant where Valar was brutal, tall and willow-thin, with silver hair pulled back from a face of aristocratic beauty. He was the king's bloodbound advisor, architect of the peace accords, the voice that had guided the Night Dominion through centuries of consolidation. He was also the man whose name Melis's grandmother had whispered in fevered nightmares before she died. The covenant documents, Corvain hissed, shoving a crystal decanter of blood wine into Melis's hands. Pour for the king's table. Move like a ghost. Disappear. Melis nodded, gripping the ancient crystal. She approached the high table where Valor now sat, his back to the stone wall, his gaze sweeping the assembled court before settling on the parchment scroll being unrolled before him. Phyrexian stood at his right hand, one pale finger tracing the ornate calligraphy of the covenant text. The rival houses have agreed to the terms, Phyrexian said, his voice a low melody of persuasion. The bloodbound peace will end 4 centuries of territorial war. You need only speak the oath, my king, and the Night Dominion will know stability eternal. Valor lifted his goblet in silent command. Melis stepped forward. She poured the blood wine, dark as garnets, smelling of iron and roses, into the king's cup with hands that never trembled. Discipline, control, invisibility. The lessons Ysilda had beaten into her bones. As the liquid swirled, Melis's ears caught the opening words of the covenant being read aloud. By blood-bound and shadow-sealed, I, Valor Sanguiner, sovereign eternal, do pledge. Her breath stopped. She knew that cadence, that specific grammatical structure, the inverted syntax that appeared benign but carried ritual weight. Melis had heard it before, once, in a story her grandmother told her on a winter night when Ysilda's hands had shaken and her voice had broken. A story about a king who signed a covenant of peace and woke the next evening unable to give a single command his advisor hadn't approved first. Melis finished pouring. She should have retreated to the shadows. Should have returned to the kitchens and worried about survival. Should have remained invisible. But her eyes caught the parchment as Phyrexian angled it toward Valor's signing hand. She saw the ritual marks in the margin, ancient sigils she'd been taught to recognize, symbols that didn't bind enemies. They bound the one who spoke to them. The king's hand moved toward the quill. Melis's heart hammered against her ribs, so hard she thought her chest might split. If she spoke, she would die. These creatures killed servants for breathing too loudly, for meeting their gaze, for existing in ways that displeased them. But if she stayed silent, an immortal king was about to cage himself in his own throne. Don't sign it, Melis whispered. The words were so quiet she barely heard them herself. Valor's hand stopped. The quill hovered over parchment. Phyrexian's head turned slowly, like a serpent sensing movement. The entire court seemed to hold its breath. Excuse me? Phyrexian's voice was silk over razors. Valor didn't move, didn't breathe. But his eyes, ancient, lethal, impossibly red, shifted to Melis for the first time. Really looked at her, saw her. The weight of that gaze was crushing. What? Valor said, each word carved from ice. Did you say? Melis's voice shook, but she forced the words past her terror. I said don't sign it. My lord, it's not a peace covenant. She swallowed. It's a blood snare. The silence that fell over the high blood hall was absolute. It was the silence before an execution. Before slaughter. Corvain appeared at the edge of her vision, his face drained of all color. He started forward, gesturing frantically. Your Majesty, this servant is new. She doesn't understand protocol. Silence, Valor commanded. Corvain froze mid-step, as if his bones had turned to stone. The king did not look away from Melis. Your servant. A human. You pour wine and keep your head down. His voice was soft, which somehow made it more terrifying. And you're telling me that Archlord Phyrexian Morn, bloodbound advisor to the throne for 3 centuries, is lying to me? Yes, my lord. Why? Melis gripped the empty decanter so tightly she felt the crystal threaten to crack. She could feel the eyes of every vampire in the hall boring into her, could smell the sudden hunger that always accompanied fear. You have 10 seconds, Valor said, leaning forward, to explain why I shouldn't let my court feed on you where you stand. Melis took one breath. Then she did the thing that would change everything. She pointed at the parchment with a shaking hand. The covenant text. The opening invocation. Her voice grew steadier as her grandmother's training took over. It uses the ritual phrasing, by blood-bound and shadow-sealed. That's syntax. It's not modern ceremonial language. So, Threxian interjected smoothly. We're formalizing an ancient accord. Of course we use traditional language. It's not traditional, Melis said, her eyes still locked on Valor. It's ancient blood tongue. The language of the first vampiric purges. The language that was outlawed and erased after the Keeper executions 400 years ago. A ripple of shock moved through the court like wind through dead leaves. Valor's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes. No one speaks the blood tongue. The Keepers are all dead. Almost all, Melis whispered. Who taught you this language? Valor demanded. My grandmother, Ysilda Corwin. The name hung in the air like a curse. Someone in the back of the hall gasped. An elder courtier, ancient beyond measure, leaned forward with eyes gone wide. Threxian's perfect composure cracked for just a fraction of a second, a flash of something cold and furious crossing his beautiful face. That name, the elder courtier said in a voice like grinding stone, has not been spoken in this court for 300 years. Melis forced herself to continue, even as her hands trembled. The phrasing in your covenant, by blood-bound and shadow-sealed. It's a reversed word. In blood-tongue grammar, when you invert the binding structure like that, you don't bind who you're making peace with. She looked directly at the parchment, then at Valor. You bind yourself. The one who speaks the oath becomes the one who's controlled. It's not a peace treaty. She met the king's terrible gaze. It's a cage, and you're about to lock yourself inside it. Nobody had spoken the blood tongue in the high blood hall since the night Ysilda Corwin had been dragged from the palace in chains, her screams echoing through corridors that remembered everything. That was the night the Keepers were purged. The night the old magic died. Or so everyone believed. But in a small room beneath the palace, a grandmother had taught her granddaughter that some knowledge was too dangerous to die, and that survival, for those who remembered, depended on knowing exactly when to break silence. The silence stretched like a blade against Melis's throat. Valor Sanguiner sat motionless, his blood-red eyes fixed on her with the intensity of a predator deciding whether to kill quickly or slowly. Around them, the high blood hall held its collective breath. Nobles frozen mid-gesture, guards with hands drifting toward weapons, the very shadows seeming to lean in closer. Explain, Valor said finally, his voice soft as grave dirt. How a servant who pours wine knows a language that every keeper died to protect. Melis's mind raced back to a memory she'd tried to bury. The cramped servants' quarters beneath the palace, where moisture wept down stone walls and the smell of mildew never quite faded. Ysilda Corwin sat in her threadbare chair, her hands gnarled with age, but steady as she held a piece of stolen parchment covered in symbols that looked like they'd been written in blood. Listen, child, Ysilda whispered, her voice hoarse from decades of enforced silence. The words themselves mean nothing. It's the intent woven into the grammar. The blood tongue doesn't ask, it commands. It doesn't suggest, it binds. 10-year-old Melis had traced the strange symbols with her finger. Why did they kill the Keepers, grandmother? Because we remembered. Ysilda's eyes had gone distant, haunted. We remembered what the first vampire lords did to seize power. We remembered the syntax of domination. And memory, little one, is the most dangerous weapon of all. The memory dissolved as Threxian's voice cut through the hall like a knife through silk. This is absurd. The Archlord's composure had returned, smooth and perfect as a mask. The girl is clearly disturbed. Perhaps she overheard fragments of old court poetry and confused them for something sinister. Your Majesty, we waste precious time. I said explain, Valor repeated, still looking at Melis. Not you, Threxian. The rebuke was gentle, but it landed like a slap. Threxian's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Melis forced herself to speak. My grandmother was Ysilda Corwin. She was a keeper of forbidden rites before the purges. She taught me the blood tongue before she taught me to read common script. The words tumbled out faster now, desperation giving them momentum. She told me to listen to the patterns, for the intent beneath the words. And what, Valor asked, is the intent beneath my covenant? Before Melis could answer, Threxian moved with fluid grace, placing himself between her and the parchment. Your Majesty, I must protest. This is a sacred ceremony. We cannot allow baseless accusations from a servant to step aside, Threxian. It wasn't a request. The Archlord's smile never wavered, but something cold flickered in his pale eyes as he moved. Barely. Just enough to maintain the illusion of obedience while still blocking clear sight of the document. Melis saw it then. The subtle way Threxian's finger rested on a specific passage, the way he angled his body to control Valor's view of the text. He was guiding the cadence, directing where the king's attention would fall when he read the oath aloud. Another memory, sharper this time. The ritual speaker always tries to control the rhythm. Ysolda had taught her, tapping out a pattern on the wooden table. They make you hear what they want you to hear. They hide the true binding in the spaces between the emphasized words. How do you stop it? Young Melis had asked. You don't stop it, child. Ysolda's expression had been grave. You break it. You speak the counterphrase before the binding completes. But only if you're willing to die for the truth. Melis looked at the parchment again, at the elegant calligraphy that hid murder in its loops and curves, at the sigils and the margins that no one else seemed to see, or perhaps they'd forgotten how to recognize them. She had a choice. She could retreat to the kitchens, bow her head, disappear back into invisibility, let the ancient king cage himself and survive another day serving wine to monsters. Or she could do what her grandmother had died for. Melis stepped forward. The movement was small, barely 2 steps, but in the rigid hierarchy of the vampire court, it was the equivalent of drawing a blade before the throne. Gasps erupted through the hall. A noble woman actually recoiled, her hand flying to her throat. Corvain made a strangled sound of pure horror. What are you doing? Threxian hissed, dropping his courtly mask for a heartbeat. Guards. But Melis was already speaking. She spoke in the ancient blood tongue, the language of domination and death, the syntax that had been erased from every text and burned from every memory. Her voice was clear and sharp, cutting through the hall like a bell tolling for execution. Kestrel Morinth. Esther Vinell. 5 words. This is a trap. The effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. The crimson light from the chandeliers flickered. The parchment on the table shuddered as if touched by an invisible wind. And every vampire in the hall recoiled as though Melis had brandished holy fire. The Bloodguard drew their weapons in perfect synchronization, the ring of steel against leather like a death knell. Blades appeared in hands that had been empty a heartbeat before. Nobles scrambled backward, knocking over chairs, their faces twisted with shock and ancient fear. Because the blood tongue wasn't just forbidden. It was proof that the old magic, the magic the vampire lords had tried to erase, still lived. She speaks heresy, someone shrieked from the back of the hall. Seize her, another voice commanded. The blood tongue is outlawed. She'll curse us all. Threxian's hand moved toward Melis, his elegant fingers curling into claws, his face finally showing the rage he'd been hiding beneath centuries of practiced civility. Then Valor raised his hand, just lifted it. A small gesture, barely a movement at all. But the hall froze as completely as if he'd stopped time itself. The guards halted mid-stride. Threxian's hand hung in the air. Even the panicked nobles fell silent, their instinctive terror of the king overriding their fear of the forbidden language. Valor stood slowly. His movements were deliberate, controlled, each motion a study in lethal grace. He walked around the table, his boots silent on the marble floor, until he stood directly before Melis. Up close, he was even more terrifying, 7 feet of immortal power wrapped in velvet and violence. His eyes bored into hers, ancient beyond comprehension, beautiful and merciless as a winter storm. You speak the blood tongue, Valor said quietly. Too quietly. A language erased from existence. A language whose last speaker died in flames 300 years ago. Melis couldn't breathe, couldn't move, could only meet those terrible eyes and wait for death. So tell me, Melis Corwin, descendant of keepers and speaker of dead words. Vaylor's voice dropped to barely a whisper, but somehow the entire hall heard it. How does a serving girl know a language erased by death itself? The question hung in the air like an executioner's blade. Melis opened her mouth to answer, but before she could speak, Threxian's voice cut through the hall with the force of a whip crack. She cannot be allowed to answer, Your Majesty. The Archlord moved forward, his composure fully restored, his face a mask of righteous horror. The blood tongue is sacrilege. Its very utterance defile this court. By ancient law, she must be executed immediately, before she can speak of further corruption. Vaylor didn't look at his advisor. His eyes remained fixed on Melis, searching for something she couldn't name. Ancient law, the king said slowly. Written by whom? Threxian? The question seemed innocent, but Melis saw Threxian hesitate for the barest fraction of a second. By the Council of Shadows, my lord. After the Keeper purges. To prevent. To prevent what? Vaylor interrupted. Knowledge? Memory? Or merely inconvenient truths? The hall had gone deathly silent. Even the nobles who'd been calling for Melis's blood seemed to sense that something had shifted, a crack forming in the foundation of certainty. My lord, with respect, Threxian began. Guards, Vaylor commanded. Take her to the Chamber of Questions. 2 bloodguard materialized at Melis's sides, their hands like iron manacles on her arms. She didn't resist. Couldn't have even if she'd wanted to. Her body had gone numb with the realization of what she'd done. She'd spoken. She'd been seen. There was no returning to invisibility now. Your Majesty, Threxian's voice had taken on an edge Melis had never heard before, sharp, urgent, almost desperate. This is highly irregular. The girl has committed sacrilege before the entire court. Tradition demands. Tradition, Vaylor said, turning finally to look at his advisor. Or convenience? The words landed like stones in still water. Threxian's perfect composure cracked again, just for an instant. His eyes flashed with something cold and furious before the mask descended once more. I serve only your interests, my king, as I have for 3 centuries. Then you'll have no objection to hearing what she has to say. Vaylor gestured to the guards. Bring her. Threxian, you will accompany us. The Chamber of Questions was a small room carved from black stone, located in the oldest part of the palace. No windows. No decorations. Just walls that had witnessed centuries of interrogations and a single table of age-darkened wood. Vaylor sat. Threxian stood at his right hand, still the picture of loyal service, but Melis could see the tension in his shoulders now. The way his fingers flexed and curled, as if imagining them around her throat. Speak, Vaylor commanded. Melis's throat was dry as ash. The covenant your archlord prepared, it uses a grammatical structure called a reversed word. In the blood tongue, the syntax determines the direction of binding. She forced herself to meet Vaylor's gaze. When you place the subject after the verb in that specific pattern, you invert the target of the ritual. The one speaking the oath becomes the one bound by it. Lies, Threxian said smoothly. Your Majesty, this is clearly a desperate fabrication. A servant girl with delusions of importance, trying to save herself by casting aspersions on. Let her finish, Vaylor said. Threxian's jaw tightened, but he fell silent. The covenant would have bound you, Melis continued, her voice gaining strength. Not to the rival houses. To whoever controls the ritual's activation phrase. You would still live, still appear to rule. But every command, every decision, it would require approval from. From whom? Vaylor asked quietly. Melis looked at Threxian. The Archlord's expression remained perfectly neutral, but something in his eyes had gone very still. Very cold. From whoever speaks the counterphrase, Melis said. Whoever completes the binding. This is absurd, Threxian interjected, his voice rising slightly. Your Majesty, she's clearly been planted here by rival houses. This is sabotage, an attempt to sow discord and prevent the peace accords. I recommend immediate execution and a full investigation into who sent her. Who sent you, Meleys Corwin? Valor asked. No one sent me, Your Majesty. I'm a servant, a waitress. I've worked in the palace for 3 years, pouring wine and staying invisible. Until tonight. Valor leaned forward. Why break the silence now? Why risk certain death? Because my grandmother told me that some truths are worth dying for, Meleys thought. But what she said was, because I recognized the ritual pattern, because I knew what it would do, and because. She hesitated, then plunged forward. Because my grandmother died trying to prevent this same betrayal 3 centuries ago. Threxian went very still. Your grandmother, Valor repeated. You said her name was Isolde Corwin. Yes, Your Majesty. There are no records of any keeper by that name. There wouldn't be, Meleys said quietly. They erased her, just like they erased all the others who witnessed the last blood-binding coup. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Even Threxian had gone pale. There was no coup, the Archlord said, but his voice had lost its certainty. The keepers were executed for heresy, for attempting to use forbidden magic against. Against whom? Threxian? Valor asked. His voice was soft, dangerous. You've never mentioned being present at the purges. I wasn't, I merely, the historical records. A knock at the door interrupted him. Enter, Valor commanded. An ancient vampire stepped into the chamber, bent with age that even immortality couldn't quite erase. He wore the gray robes of the palace record keepers, and his eyes were milky with centuries. Your Majesty summoned me? His voice creaked like old parchment. You're the eldest keeper, are you not? You maintain the palace archives. For 400 years, my lord. Then answer me this. Valor never took his eyes off Threxian. Was there ever a keeper named Isolde Corwin who served this throne? The old vampire's brow furrowed. He was silent for a long moment, searching for a memory that stretched across centuries. Then his milky eyes widened. Yes, he whispered. Yes, there was. I remember now. She served king more than the pale. Before your reign, my lord. She was. He paused, trembling slightly. She was the last keeper executed. The night the blood tongue died. The silence that followed was absolute. Valor turned slowly to look at Threxian. You were there that night, weren't you, old friend? Threxian's mask finally shattered. I was a junior advisor, he said quickly, the words tumbling out with uncharacteristic haste. Barely a century old. I witnessed the executions, yes, but I had no hand in. You never mentioned this, Valor said softly. Dangerously. In 300 years of council, you never once mentioned being present at the keeper purges. It was irrelevant, my lord. Ancient history. I saw no reason to. Or perhaps, the old record keeper interrupted, his voice gaining unexpected strength. You had reason to forget. He turned to Valor. Your Majesty, there's something you should know. The archives from that period, they're incomplete. Someone removed entire sections. Pages cut from binding scrolls. Whole volumes are missing. Meleys felt her grandmother's voice echoing across the years. They'll try to erase it all, child. They already have. But memory lives in blood, and blood remembers what paper forgets. Young Meleys had been sitting cross-legged on the cold stone floor of their quarters, watching Isolde's gnarled fingers trace symbols in spilled salt. Tell me again, Meleys had whispered, about the night you saw the king die without dying. Isolde's eyes had grown distant, haunted. King more than the pale. He was clever, powerful, and absolutely ruthless. But he trusted his blood-bound advisors. Trusted the old oaths. Her finger had circled a particularly complex symbol. The night of the Unity Covenant, I was serving in the ritual chamber. I heard them speak the binding. Heard the cadence shift. By the time I understood what was happening, it was too late. What happened to him? He lived. still ruled on paper. But every command had to be approved, every decision filtered through his advisors. He was a puppet wearing a crown, and no one knew except those of us who understood the language. Why didn't you tell someone? I tried, child. Ysolda's voice had broken. I tried. That's why they came for us. The memory dissolved as Vaylor's voice cut through the chamber. Explain, he commanded the record keeper. Explain everything you know about that night. The old vampire trembled. I was young then, my lord. I only know what I was told to preserve. The official record states that the keepers attempted a coup, that they tried to use the blood tongue to overthrow King Morthen. And the unofficial record? Vaylor pressed. There isn't one. It was removed. But I remember whispers. I remember senior keepers speaking in corners, saying the keepers had tried to stop something, not start it. His milky eyes found Maelys. And I remember the woman they executed last. Ysolda Corwin. She wouldn't stop screaming the truth, even as they dragged her to the pyre. What truth? Vaylor asked, his voice barely a whisper now. That King Morthen had been bound. That the coup had already succeeded. The old vampire's voice dropped. She screamed it in the blood tongue, so everyone would understand. And then they burned her alive to make sure no one ever would again. Maelys felt tears burning in her eyes. She'd known her grandmother died badly, but hearing it spoken aloud, confirmed by someone who'd been there. Your Majesty, Threxian said, recovering some of his composure. This is all conjecture, rumor and conspiracy theory. Even if Ysolda Corwin did witness something irregular, it has no bearing on. On what? Vaylor stood abruptly, his chair scraping against stone. On the fact that you were present at a suspected coup and never mentioned it? On the fact that archives were destroyed? On the fact that you just tried to make me sign a covenant using the exact same ritual structure? That's coincidence. Is it? Vaylor moved toward Threxian with predatory grace. Tell me, old friend, where were you standing the night King Morthen signed his unity covenant? Threxian's face went carefully blank. I don't recall. It was centuries ago. I think you recall perfectly. The Archlord's eyes flickered to Maelys, and in that moment, she saw the calculation there, the assessment of threats, the decision being made. Your Majesty, Threxian said carefully, I understand you're disturbed by these revelations. But consider the source. A servant girl who claims forbidden knowledge, spinning tales to save herself from execution. Perhaps we should. She knew the ritual structure, Vaylor interrupted. She recognized what I couldn't see. That suggests her grandmother did teach her. Which means Ysolda Corwin preserved the very knowledge someone tried to erase. Maelys found her voice. She trained me for this. I didn't understand it before, but now. Everything clicked into place with terrible clarity. She knew this would happen again. She knew someone would try the same binding. So she taught me to recognize it, to stop it. You're not just learning a language, child. Ysolda had told her during their final lesson, weeks before she died. You're learning to see power for what it truly is. Naked, hungry, always repeating itself. Her grandmother had gripped her shoulders with surprising strength. Promise me. Promise that if you ever hear these patterns spoken in the High Blood Hall, you'll speak, even if it costs everything. I promised her, Maelys whispered to Vaylor. I promised I'd speak. The king studied her for a long moment. Then he turned to Threxian. Tomorrow, we'll examine the covenant line by line. We'll verify every claim this girl has made. And if she's right, the chamber door burst open. A blood guard stumbled in, his face ashen with shock. Your Majesty, the High Blood Hall, something's happening. The covenant parchment, it's glowing. Vaylor's head snapped toward the guard. That's impossible. The ritual hasn't been completed. Nevertheless, my lord, the sigils are activating. And the guard's voice dropped to a horrified whisper. And nobles are starting to collapse. Maelys felt ice flood her veins. Too early, she breathed. The trap was designed to spring even without the full ritual. He must have had a contingency. She looked at Threxian. The Archlord smiled. It was a terrible smile, cold and ancient and utterly without mercy. "Perhaps," Threxian said quietly, "we should return to the hall, before there's no court left to rule. If you're on the edge of your seat wondering whether Melis will survive this night, if you're desperate to know whether truth can actually defeat centuries of beautiful lies, then you're in the right place. Make sure you've hit subscribe, because stories like this don't come around every day. And I want to know, would you risk everything to save someone who could kill you with a thought? Tell me in the comments. Now back to the High Blood Hall, where the trap is about to spring." They ran. Valor moved like liquid shadow, his boots silent on marble as they raced through corridors of black stone. The Bloodguard flanked them, weapons drawn. Behind them, Melis heard Threxian's measured footsteps, unhurried, almost leisurely, as if he already knew what they would find. The screaming reached them before they arrived. Valor hit the doors to the High Blood Hall with enough force to tear them from their hinges. They exploded inward, revealing carnage. The sigils carved into the margins of the Covenant parchment blazed with crimson light, casting everything in the color of fresh blood. But it wasn't just the parchment. Identical marks had manifested throughout the hall, burning on columns, across the floor, etched into the very air itself. And wherever the sigils touched, nobles collapsed. They fell like puppets with cut strings, ancient vampires who'd survived centuries crumpling to their knees, clutching their throats, their eyes wide with incomprehension and terror. Some were screaming. Others made no sound at all, their mouths open in silent agony as invisible chains wrapped around their essence. "Blood-binding," the old record keeper gasped from behind them. "Multiple simultaneous bindings. This is massacre." "No," Melis breathed, horror flooding through her. "Not massacre. Enslavement." She recognized the pattern now. The sigils weren't killing, they were claiming. Wrapping around every vampire in the hall who held significant power, preparing to transfer their loyalty, their very will, to whoever completed the ritual. Movement in the shadows. Figures emerged from alcoves where servants usually stood invisible. But these weren't servants. They moved with deadly precision, faces hidden behind black cloth, blades gleaming in the crimson light. Assassins. The first one lunged at Valor with inhuman speed. The king moved faster. He caught the assassin's wrist mid-strike, twisted with casual brutality, and tore the arm from its socket. Blood sprayed across marble. The assassin's scream was cut short as Valor's other hand closed around his throat and crushed it to pulp. 3 more came at once. Valor fought like something born from a nightmare, every movement economical, lethal, absolutely precise. He moved between them like a dancer, but where he touched, bones shattered and flesh tore. These were trained killers, vampire assassins who'd probably ended hundreds of lives. They lasted 15 seconds. But more were coming. Too many, emerging from hiding places throughout the hall. They'd been planted here, Melis realized. Waiting. This wasn't improvisation. This was planned down to the smallest detail. "Your Majesty." A blood guard went down, an assassin's blade through his spine. Another guard moved to defend, but the sigils on the floor flared brighter, and he staggered, clutching his head. "They're activating in sequence," Melis shouted over the chaos. The blood-tongue patterns her grandmother had taught her suddenly made horrifying sense. The sigils, they're forming a binding circle. If they complete the pattern, everyone in this hall becomes what? Valor demanded, ripping an assassin's head clean off. "Property." Valor's eyes found hers across the chaos. "Can you stop it?" "I don't. I'm not sure." "Can you stop it?" Melis looked at the sigils. On the way they pulsed in rhythm, like a heartbeat, like a living thing consuming the hall piece by piece. The counter-pattern Ysolda had taught her, drawing symbols in salt while young Melis watched. Every binding has a weakness. A structural flaw. You have to see it. Listen for it. "Yes," Melis said. "Maybe, but you have to move." The sigils activate based on proximity to power. They're targeting you specifically. You have to stay ahead of the sequence. "Where?" Valor grabbed her arm, pulling her close as an assassin's blade whistled past her head. He killed the attacker without looking. Melis scanned the hall, seeing the pattern emerge from chaos. The sigils were spreading from the Covenant table outward, but not evenly. They followed lines of power, ancient pathways carved into the palace's foundation. Northwest corner, she said. Move toward the old archives entrance. The sigils can't cross running water, and there's a fountain. Valor moved before she finished speaking, dragging her with him. They ran through falling nobles and fighting guards, through blood that made the marble slick and treacherous. An assassin stepped in their path. Valor threw Melis behind him and caught the killer's blade with his bare hand. The steel bit deep into his palm, but he didn't flinch. Just pulled the assassin forward onto his other hand, claws extended, and tore out the creature's heart. Keep talking, Valor commanded, not even breathing hard. What happens when this sequence completes? The binding activates. Everyone caught in the circle becomes bound to whoever speaks the activation phrase. Threxian. Yes. Where is he? Valor's eyes scanned the chaos. Where did that bastard go? Melis looked back. The Archlord had vanished, disappeared the moment the violence began, like smoke dissipating in the wind. They reached the fountain, an ancient thing of black stone with water that bubbled up from deep below the palace. The sigils approaching them flickered and died as they crossed the water's barrier, unable to bridge the flowing divide. A temporary reprieve. Nothing more. The sequence, Valor said, watching sigils pulse closer across the hall. You said they activate in order. Can you predict the pattern? Melis closed her eyes, reaching for everything her grandmother had taught her. Listening not with her ears, but with the part of her mind that understood the grammar of domination. Yes, she whispered. The next activation point is... Her eyes snapped open in horror. The throne. The sigils are converging on your throne. Of course they are. Valor's smile was sharp and terrible. A symbolic anchor. Bind the throne. Bind the kingdom. He looked at her. Can you disrupt it? If I can reach the throne before the pattern completes, maybe. But what? I'd have to say the counterphrase. In blood tongue. And doing that, Melis swallowed. Doing that binds me into the ritual. Makes me part of the structure. It would tie my fate to the throne forever. Valor studied her face. You'd go from invisible servant to bound to the crown. No middle ground. No going back. No going back, Melis agreed. Around them, the hall was descending into chaos. More nobles had fallen. The surviving guards were overwhelmed. And the sigils were spreading, pulsing with hunger that would consume everything. Your choice, Valor said. Stay here, stay safe. Or save everyone. Melis finished. She stepped away from the fountain's protection. The sigils immediately sensed her, turning like living things drawn to movement. But Melis was already running toward the throne, toward the center of the binding circle, her lips forming words in a language that should have died centuries ago. Behind her, Valor followed, cutting down any assassin foolish enough to try to stop her. Melis reached the throne. The Covenant parchment lay on the floor beside it, still glowing, the sigils crawling across its surface like feeding insects. She knelt, placed her hands on the ancient stone of the throne's base, and began to speak. The blood tongue flowed from her lips. Not a whisper this time, but a command. The syntax of undoing. The grammar of freedom. Words her grandmother had made her memorize but never explained, because explanation would have been too dangerous. Now Melis understood why. The sigils screamed. The sound was somehow audible, a shrieking dissonance that made her teeth ache. They writhed, fighting against her counter-pattern, but she kept speaking, forcing the words out even as her vision blurred and her nose began to bleed. The binding was breaking, but not completely. It's still incomplete, Melis gasped, tasting copper. The original ritual? Threxian didn't finish it, but he didn't need to. He must have. Horror flooded through her. He must have already spoken the activation phrase. Before he even came to the hall tonight. This was always going to happen, signature or not. Valor's expression went cold as death. Then the Covenant was just theater. Theater to get you in position. To distract you while the real trap closes around everything you rule. A slow clap echoed through the hall. Phyrexian Morn stepped out of the shadows near the main doors, his elegant face finally showing triumph undisguised. "Very good, little keeper," he said. "Your grandmother would be proud. You delayed the inevitable. But you cannot stop what's already begun." Phyrexian walked through the chaos like a king surveying his new domain. Around him, nobles lay collapsed or dying. Guards struggled against assassins who seemed to multiply from shadows. The sigils pulsed with sickly light, waiting for the final word to complete their hunger. But Phyrexian's attention was fixed entirely on Valor. 300 years, the Archlord said, his voice carrying across the hall with preternatural clarity. 300 years I've guided you, advised you, served you with perfect loyalty. Do you know why, old friend? Valor said nothing. His hands were still wet with blood, his eyes tracking Phyrexian's every movement with predatory focus. "Because I was patient," Phyrexian continued. "Because I understood that true power isn't taken in a night of violence. It's cultivated, shaped, made it inevitable." He gestured to the dying court around them. "I didn't need to kill you, Valor. I only needed you to trust me." Melis's hands were still pressed against the throne, her mind racing through the fragments of ritual she'd disrupted. The counter-pattern had stopped the immediate binding, but Phyrexian was right. Something deeper was already in motion. Something she'd missed. "Always look at what they did before the ritual began," Ysilda had warned. "The visible ceremony is just the final seal. The real work happens in the preparation." "The blood-bound oath," Melis whispered, realization striking like lightning. "It wasn't just tonight. You've been weaving it for centuries," Phyrexian confirmed, his smile widening. "Every piece of counsel, every strategic recommendation, every oath of loyalty I swore before this court." He touched his chest, right over his heart. "Bloodbound isn't a single ritual, Your Majesty. It's a tapestry, thread by thread, year by year, binding myself to you and you to me." Valor's expression didn't change, but Melis saw his jaw tighten. "Bloodbound oaths ensure loyalty. They ensure compliance," Phyrexian corrected. "The syntax is very specific. When a vampire binds himself in blood service to another, he cannot raise arms against his lord, cannot betray his trust, cannot disobey direct commands." He paused, letting the weight of the words sink in. "But there's a clause, buried deep in the old texts, a reversal protocol." "No," Melis breathed. The pieces were falling into place with sickening clarity. "If the bloodbound proves the master has violated the terms of protection, the binding inverts," Phyrexian finished. "The servant becomes the master. The protector becomes the sovereign. And the king," his eyes gleamed with triumph, "the king becomes the bound." The silence that followed was absolute. "More than," Valor said quietly. "That's what you did to King More Than. I was younger then, less patient. I forced the reversal too quickly, and witnesses like Ysilda Corwin noticed." Phyrexian's expression darkened. "So with you, I took my time. 3 centuries of perfect service. 3 centuries of protection. No one could question my loyalty. No one could doubt my devotion." He spread his hands. "Until tonight, when I create the perfect violation, a covenant that threatens your sovereignty, signed under my counsel. Proof of failure to protect. That's why you needed the ceremony," Melis said, horror flooding through her. "Why do you need witnesses? The bloodbound reversal requires public demonstration of failed protection," Phyrexian agreed. "The covenant would have bound Valor, yes. But even without his signature, the attempt itself, made under my guidance, in front of the entire court, triggers the reversal clause. I failed to protect him from betrayal because I am the betrayal." His smile was terrible. "Elegant, isn't it?" Valor moved with blinding speed, crossing half the hall before Phyrexian even blinked. But the Archlord didn't flinch, didn't move. Valor's hand stopped inches from Phyrexian's throat, stopped as if it had hit an invisible wall. You can't touch me, Phyrexian said softly. The bloodbound is already reversing. You can feel it, can't you? The weight of 3 centuries of oaths turning themselves inside out. Every vow I made to serve you is becoming a chain around your will. Valar's hand trembled. Meleys saw the strain on his face, the ancient king fighting against invisible bonds that were tightening with every heartbeat. When the reversal completes, Phyrexian continued, you'll still be king. You'll still sit on that throne, still command armies, still appear to rule. But every decision will require my approval. Every command will need my consent. You'll be sovereign in name and my puppet in truth. Like more than was yours, Valar ground out through clenched teeth. More than served me well for 50 years before the strain broke his mind. You're stronger. You'll last longer. Phyrexian turned to survey the hall. And through you, I'll finally reshape the Night Dominion into what it should have been centuries ago. Meleys's mind raced. The counter-pattern she'd spoken had disrupted the Covenant sigils, but Phyrexian was right. The real trap was older, deeper, woven into the very fabric of his service. To undo it, she would need to unravel 3 centuries of bloodbound ritual. Unless. The witness clause, Meleys said suddenly. Bloodbound reversals require a public witness to validate the failure of protection. Phyrexian's eyes snapped to her. Yes. And you've provided it beautifully, little keeper. You and every surviving noble in this hall have witnessed my failure, my betrayal, made manifest. But we've also witnessed something else, Meleys said, her voice growing stronger. Your confession. Your admission that every oath you swore was a lie from the beginning. Phyrexian's smile faltered. Bloodbound oaths only bind if made in sincerity. Meleys continued, remembering Ysildur's teaching. If the original vows were false, made with intent to betray, then they were never legitimate bindings. They were just words. They can't reverse, because they were never real. Clever, Phyrexian said, but his voice had lost its certainty. But it changes nothing. The ritual momentum is too great. The pattern is too established. Even if the original bindings were flawed, 3 centuries of reinforcement has made them vulnerable. Meleys interrupted. You said it yourself. The reversal requires public demonstration. But this court just heard you confess that every moment of your service was theater. That means every binding built on that service is compromised. Valar's hand moved forward another inch. Still couldn't reach Phyrexian's throat, but the invisible wall was weakening. Phyrexian's composure cracked. This changes nothing. The sigils are still active. My assassins still outnumber your guards. And the reversal is too far progressed to stop. I've won, Valar. I've already won. Then why? Valar asked, his voice deadly calm even as he strained against invisible chains. Are you still talking? Phyrexian's expression went cold. Because I'm giving you a choice. Accept the inevitable. Bow to the new order. Make this transition peaceful. Or what? Valar smiled, and it was terrifying. You'll kill me? You can't. The bloodbound won't let you harm me until the reversal completes. And if Meleys is right about your oaths being void, the reversal will never complete. She's a servant girl with fragments of knowledge. Phyrexian snarled, his mask finally shattering completely. She doesn't have the power to. She has something better, Valar said. She has the truth. Phyrexian's face twisted with rage. He raised his hand, and the remaining assassins moved as one, converging on the throne. Then let's finish this the old way, Phyrexian said. If I can't bind you, I'll simply take your throne over your corpse. Bloodbound oaths be damned. The assassins came like a dark wave crashing toward the throne. Valar moved to intercept them, but the invisible chains of the corrupted bloodbound still held him. His movements were slower, constrained, fighting against bonds that shouldn't exist but did. He wouldn't make it. There were too many moving too fast, and he was fighting himself as much as them. Meleys saw it all with terrible clarity. This was the final gambit. If Phyrexian couldn't complete the binding, he'd simply decapitate the kingdom and claim the throne through violence. Maelys Corwin, Valer's voice cut through the chaos like a blade. Stand beside me. Time seemed to freeze. Every surviving noble turned to stare. The old record keeper's mouth fell open. Even some of the assassins hesitated mid-stride, shocked by the impossible breach of protocol. A servant. At the king's right hand. The position reserved for bloodbound advisors, for heirs, for those of ancient lineage and unquestionable authority. Your Majesty, a noble gasped from where he lay collapsed. That's sacrilege. That's an order, Valer said. His eyes never left Phyrexian. She speaks for the throne. Refuse her words, and you refuse me. Maelys felt the weight of every gaze in the hall crash down on her. This was visibility beyond anything she'd imagined. Not just being seen, but being elevated. Made undeniable. Her legs shook as she stood. Walked the 3 steps to Valer's side. Stood where Phyrexian had stood for 3 centuries. This is madness, Phyrexian hissed. A waitress? You would replace me with a human child who pours wine. I would replace you, Valer said coldly, with someone who tells the truth. She doesn't have the authority. I just gave it to her. Valer gestured to Maelys, without looking away from Phyrexian. Explain it to them. All of it. Every detail of how this bastard tried to cage us all. Maelys's throat was dry as bone. She looked out at the assembled court, ancient vampires who'd lived centuries, nobles who could kill her with a thought, survivors of a massacre still unfolding around them. And she began to speak. The covenant you saw tonight was written in ancient blood tongue, she said, her voice shaking but growing stronger with each word. The grammar of that language doesn't just communicate, it binds. It commands. Every sentence structure carries ritual weight. We know what blood tongue is, a noble interrupted. It's forbidden. The fact that you speak it should make you listen, Valer said quietly. The noble fell silent. Maelys continued, the opening phrase of the covenant, by blood bound and shadow sealed, uses inverted syntax. In blood tongue, when you place the binding verb before the subject, you reverse the target of the ritual. Archlord Phyrexian designed the oath to bind not the rival houses to peace, but King Valer to obedience. Murmurs rippled through the hall, shock mixing with dawning comprehension. That's a lie, Phyrexian snapped. A desperate fabrication from a girl trying to. The sigils on the parchment. Maelys spoke over him, her voice finding unexpected strength. They're not decorative. They're activation marks for a binding circle that would have transferred sovereignty from the one who speaks the oath to the one who controls the ritual's completion phrase. She looked directly at Phyrexian. From the king to his advisor. Impossible, another noble said, but his voice wavered with uncertainty. Not impossible, Maelys said. Just forgotten. Deliberately erased from history 300 years ago, when Archlord Phyrexian used the same ritual on King more than the Pale. The hall erupted. Nobles who'd collapsed found strength to rise. Guards turned to look at Phyrexian with new eyes. Even the assassins seemed uncertain, their advance faltering. You have no proof, Phyrexian said, but his voice had lost its command. Ancient stories and conspiracy theories. I have the syntax, Maelys said. I have the grammatical structure that proves intent. And I have. She reached for the covenant parchment, still glowing with fading sigils. I have the evidence written in your own hand. She held the parchment up, pointing to specific phrases.
Here.
The subordinate clause that mirrors the exact pattern used in King Morthen's Unity Covenant. And here, her finger traced a marginal sigil. This mark. It's not in any modern text. It only appears in one place. The execution records of the keepers, describing the ritual they died trying to stop. How would you know that? Phyrexian demanded. Because my grandmother showed me. Before they burned her alive for witnessing your first coup. The silence that followed was deafening. She's right, the old record keeper said, his voice carrying across the hall. I remember now. The execution records. I was told to archive them, but never read them. But I remember the seals on the documents, He looked at the parchment in Melis's hands. That mark. That exact mark. The court began to turn. Melis could see it happening. Ancient loyalties cracking, certainty crumbling, nobles looking at Threxian not with respect, but with dawning horror and rage. 3 centuries, one elder noble breathed. 3 centuries of lies. 3 centuries of service. Threxian shouted. Everything I did was for the strength of the Night Dominion. To consolidate power, to eliminate weakness. To steal a throne, Valor finished. His voice was soft, but it carried the weight of absolute judgment. You didn't serve me, Threxian.
You hunted me.
With patience and smiles and perfect loyalty that was always a trap. Melis felt something shift in the air. The invisible chains binding Valor were weakening rapidly now, unraveling as the court's collective witness validated what she'd exposed. Blood-bound oaths built on lies couldn't survive truth spoken aloud. Threxian must have felt it too. His composure finally shattered completely. You think you've won? Do you think exposing me changes anything? I've lived for over 500 years. I've toppled kingdoms. You've failed, Valor said. He stepped forward, and this time nothing stopped him. The blood-bound chains snapped like rotten thread. And now you'll answer for every life you've corrupted, every vow you've poisoned, every truth you've tried to bury. Threxian backed away, his elegant face twisted with rage and, for the first time, fear. The court will never accept her word over mine. She's a servant, a human. She's the voice of the forbidden, Valor said. The last speaker of truths we tried to erase. And she stands at my right hand because she earned it by saving this kingdom from you. Melis realized with sudden, terrible clarity that she would never be invisible again. Never return to pouring wine and keeping her head down. She'd stepped into power, and power had closed around her like a cage made of light. There was no going back. Valor turned to face Threxian fully, and his smile was sharp as broken glass. You know the blood tongue, don't you? You must. You've been using it for centuries, weaving rituals in secret, speaking oaths that shouldn't exist. I don't know what you. Prove it, Valor commanded. Speak the counter-oath. If you truly served me in sincerity, if your blood-bound vows were genuine, then speak the words of unbinding. Show this court that your service was real. Threxian's face went pale. I won't play your games. Because you can't. Melis said quietly. Because speaking blood tongue requires intent to align with syntax. If you try to speak words of truth while holding centuries of deception, the language will tear him apart from the inside, Valor finished. So speak, old friend. Speak the blood tongue. Show us your truth. Threxian stood frozen, trapped between the throne and the assembled court that no longer saw him as advisor, but as predator finally cornered. I won't, he said, his voice low and dangerous. You have no authority to compel me to. I have every authority. Valor's words weren't loud, but they resonated with the weight of absolute sovereignty. You bound yourself to me for 3 centuries. You swore oaths of service in blood and shadow. If those oaths were true, you can speak of their undoing. If they were false, his smile was terrible. Then the language itself will judge you. Your Majesty, Threxian said, a note of desperation creeping into his cultured voice. This is barbaric. I demand trial by. By what? Blood combat. Valor gestured to the hall filled with fallen nobles and dead assassins. You already chose violence. Now I'm offering you mercy. Speak the words. Prove your centuries of counsel were genuine. Or confirm what we all now know, that you were always a serpent wearing the mask of a friend. The remaining court nobles watched with ravenous attention. Some had managed to stand despite the residual effects of the sigils. Others still lay collapsed but conscious, their ancient eyes fixed on the confrontation with the hunger of those who sensed a power shift of historical magnitude. Melis felt Yisildah's teachings crystallize in her mind. The blood tongue doesn't forgive deception, she said quietly. It's a language of absolute intent. If you try to speak words of loyalty while carrying betrayal in your heart, the contradiction will. Silence. Threxian hissed at her. Then, turning to Valor, you would take the word of a servant over 3 centuries of proven service? Proven service was a cage being built word by word, Valor said. Speak, Threxian, or I'll assume your silence is confession. Threxian's jaw worked. His hands clenched and unclenched at his sides. Melis could see the calculation in his eyes, weighing odds, searching for escape, finding none. Finally, with visible effort, he straightened, drew himself up to his full height. Very well. If this farce will satisfy you. He closed his eyes, took a breath, and began to speak in the ancient blood tongue. Kesnavai Morthane Vinstra? The words were perfect. The pronunciation is flawless. The cadence is exactly right for an unbinding oath, a formal release of bloodbound service sworn in sincerity. But Melis heard it. The thing only a true speaker would catch. Stop, she said. Threxian's eyes snapped open, fury and something like fear warring in them. He's lying, Melis said to Valor. The words are correct, but the intent marker. She turned to address the court, speaking loud enough for all to hear. In blood tongue, the 3rd syllable of Morthane should rise in pitch when speaking truth-binding. He dropped. That means he's speaking the form of the oath, but inverting its meaning. He's not releasing his binding. He's trying to reinforce it while pretending to release it. That's absurd, Threxian snapped. Subtle pronunciation means nothing. It means everything, Melis interrupted. It's the difference between I serve you and I cage you. The syntax is identical. Only intent, carried in the tone, distinguishes them. Valor's expression went cold as Winter's heart. Finish the oath, Threxian. And this time, speak it true. I did speak the truth. This girl doesn't know what she. Finish it, Valor commanded. Power rolled off him in waves. Not magical, but the authority of an ancient king who'd ruled through centuries and would not be denied. Speak the unbinding with true intent, or I'll know your service was always false. Threxian's mask finally shattered completely. His beautiful face twisted with rage and hatred that must have been buried for centuries. You want the truth? Fine. I'll give you the truth. He spoke again. This time, the words came out differently, faster, sharper, edged with venom. Kesnavai Morthane Vinstra Olith Kale Thras. Melis gasped. That's not the unbinding oath. That's... The air screamed. Threxian was trying to speak a binding reinforcement, trying to force the corrupted bloodbound oath to complete through sheer will and the power of the ancient language. But he'd miscalculated catastrophically. You couldn't speak an oath of domination while standing in a court that had witnessed your confession of betrayal. Couldn't speak words of loyalty while radiating 3 centuries of accumulated deception. The blood tongue didn't accept the contradiction. It destroyed it. The sigils throughout the hall flared blindingly bright, not the crimson of Threxian's trap, but white-hot, the color of burning truth. They turned on him like living things converging, tightening. Threxian screamed. It wasn't a sound of physical pain. It was something deeper, the sound of a soul being unraveled by its own contradictions, torn apart by language that demanded absolute truth and found only lies. His elegant form began to crack like porcelain under strain. Black fissures appeared on his skin, spreading from his chest outward. The blood-bound oaths he'd woven for centuries, all the false vows, all the poison loyalty, all the betrayal wrapped in smiles, turned inward, consuming their architect. No, Threxian gasped, falling to his knees. No, I ruled empires. I shaped kingdoms. You built your power on lies, Valor said coldly. And lies, when spoken in blood tongue, become execution. Threxian tried to speak again, perhaps to recant, perhaps to beg. But the words wouldn't come. The blood tongue had judged him, and its judgment was absolute. The fissures spread. The ancient vampire, 500 years old, architect of coups, poisoner of loyalty, crumbled to ash where he knelt. The white light faded. Silence fell over the high-blood hall like a burial shroud. The remaining nobles stared at the pile of ash that had been Archlord Threxian Morn. Some looked horrified, others vindicated. All looked shaken to their ancient cores. The bloodbound system, the very structure that had held the court together for centuries, had collapsed. Every noble who'd sworn such oaths felt them snap, felt the artificial loyalty dissolve, leaving only choice and fear. Because if lies spoken in blood tongue could unmake someone as powerful as Threxian, what did that mean for everyone else who'd ever bent truth in service to power? Valor stood in the center of his devastated court, looking at the ashes of his longest-serving advisor. His face was unreadable, not triumphant, not grieving, just ancient and tired and perhaps, finally, free. Then he turned to look at Melis, the girl who'd poured wine and kept her head down, the servant who'd spoken when silence would have been safer, the last living keeper of a language that could kill with truth. Melis Corwin, Valor said, his voice carrying across the silent hall. The Night Dominion owes you a debt that cannot be measured in gold or titles. You saved not just my life, but my sovereignty, my freedom, everything that I am. Melis felt every eye in the hall turn to her again, felt the weight of visibility that would never lift. What would you ask of me? Valor continued. What reward could possibly suffice? Melis looked at the ashes, at the fallen nobles, at the devastation wrought by centuries of beautiful eyes. And she realized she already knew her answer. I don't want a reward, Melis said. The words fell into silence, so complete she could hear her own heartbeat. Around her, the surviving nobles exchanged glances of confusion. Even Valor's expression shifted, something like surprise crossing his ancient features. Explain, the king said. Melis looked at the pile of ash that had been Threxian, at the fallen court, at the blood-stained marble and the sigils that were finally, slowly fading from the stones. Everything that happened tonight, all of this, happened because power was hidden behind beautiful eyes, because loyalty was enforced through binding rather than earned through truth. She met Valor's gaze. If you give me a title, make me a noble, place me in your hierarchy, you're just filling the space Threxian left. You're putting another person at your right hand who you'll have to wonder about. Another voice that might be building another cage. So you want nothing? Valor asked. After saving my throne, would you return to the servants' quarters and pour wine as if this night never happened? I can't return to invisibility, Melis said quietly. I understand that, but I don't want to be owned either. Not by title, not by obligation, not by the hierarchy that let Threxian hide his betrayal for 3 centuries. Then what do you want? Melis took a breath. This was the moment, the choice that would define everything that came after. I want to be what my grandmother died trying to be, she said. A keeper, a witness, someone who remembers what power tries to erase. She gestured to the devastated hall. The blood tongue isn't just a language, it's a tool for truth. It can't be spoken with deception. That makes it dangerous to every beautiful lie, every comfortable corruption, every slow poison dressed as loyalty. She turned to face the assembled court. The Night Dominion needs someone who stands outside the hierarchy. Someone who can speak truth to power without being part of the power structure. Someone who remembers. A voice of the forbidden, the old record keeper said softly. Like the keepers of old, before they were corrupted by proximity to the throne. Yes, Melis said. Not an advisor. Not a noble. Not someone who serves at your pleasure or owes you fealty. Just. She searched for the words. Just someone who holds the truth. Who speaks it when it needs speaking. Who ensures that what happened tonight can never be forgotten or rewritten by history. Valor was quiet for a long moment, studying her with those ancient, blood-red eyes. You understand what you're refusing, he finally said. I'm offering you protection, status, wealth, a place in this court where no one would dare touch you. And you're choosing to remain apart, vulnerable, always at risk, because the truth is never safe. I know, Meili said. But my grandmother died for truth. The least I can do is live for it. A strange expression crossed Valor's face. Something that might have been respect, or sadness, or perhaps the recognition of something he'd lost centuries ago.
Very well, he said.
He raised his voice to address the entire hall. Let it be known throughout the Night Dominion. The practice of bloodbound oaths is hereby outlawed. No vampire shall bind another through ritual language. No advisor shall weave loyalty through syntax rather than earn it through action. Murmurs rippled through the court, some shocked, some relieved, all uncertain about this new order. Furthermore, Valor continued, I name Melis Corwin as voice of the forbidden. She serves no master, swears no oath, holds no title that can be stripped or corrupted. She exists to remember, to witness, and to speak truth when truth is needed, even, or especially, when that truth threatens the throne itself. He looked at her. Does this suffice? Melis felt the weight of it settle over her shoulders. Not the weight of chains or obligation, but of purpose, of choice freely made. Yes, Your Majesty. Then we agreed. Valor turned to the devastated court. This hall will be cleansed. The fallen will be honored. And we will rebuild, not on the foundation of enforced loyalty, but on something stronger. Something that Threxian never understood. What's that, Your Majesty? A noble asked. Trust earned, Valor said simply. Not loyalty stolen. 3 days later, Melis stood in the servants' quarters beneath the palace. Her old room looked smaller than she remembered, cramped and dark, smelling of mildew and old stone. She was packing her grandmother's few possessions. The stolen parchments are covered in blood tongue symbols. The salt-stained teaching notes. The memories pressed between pages. Remember, child, Ysolda had told her during their final lesson, her grandmother's hands shaking but her voice steady. Power always forgets, always rewrites, always tries to make the past serve the present. That's why there must always be someone who stands outside power and says, no, this is what really happened. This is what we really did. This is who we really are. Even if it costs everything? Young Melis had asked. Especially if it costs everything. Melis folded the parchments carefully, reverently. She would preserve them, teach them to others, perhaps, when the time comes. Ensure that the blood tongue, the language of truth that couldn't abide lies, would never be erased again. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts.
Come in, she called.
Valor stood in the doorway. He looked strange in the cramped servants' quarters, too large, too powerful, like a wolf entering a rabbit's burrow. But he bent his head to fit through the door, and something about the gesture felt almost respectful. The court architect has prepared chambers for you, he said. In the east wing. Windows overlooking the mountains. Space for libraries for students if you choose to take them. Everything you might need. I haven't decided if I'm staying in the palace, Melis said. I know. Valor smiled slightly. That's why I'm asking rather than commanding. The voice of the forbidden doesn't take orders, after all. Melis looked at him. This ancient creature who'd ruled for centuries, who could kill her without effort, who just lost his longest-serving advisor and nearly lost his throne. Why did you hesitate? She asked suddenly. In the hall when I first spoke. You could have executed me immediately. Why didn't you? Valor was quiet for a moment. Because I heard your voice shake with terror, but you spoke anyway. Because you had everything to lose and nothing to gain except being right. He met her eyes. And because after 3 centuries of perfect, beautiful, poisoned loyalty from Threxian, I'd forgotten what genuine courage looked like. He turned to leave, then paused in the doorway. The chambers are yours if you want them. But regardless of where you live, Melis Corwin, he looked back at her. Thank you for speaking when silence would have saved you. For choosing truth over survival. For being what this kingdom needed more than it needed another noble. When he was gone, Melis returned to her packing. But she found herself smiling slightly. She'd started the week as invisible. Ended it as indispensable. Not because she'd claimed power, but because she'd spoken truth. And somehow, impossibly, she'd survived it. The high blood hall had been rebuilt. New marble replaced blood-stained floors. New chandeliers hung where old ones had been torn down in violence. But the scars remained, deliberately preserved in certain stones, certain columns, as permanent reminders. Melis stood at the edge of the hall, watching nobles arrive for the first major court assembly since that terrible night. She wore simple robes, gray, unmarked, neither servant's uniform nor noble's finery. Just clothes that marked her as a part. Several nobles nodded to her as they passed. A few smiled. Others looked uncertain, still adjusting to a court where truth was a weapon and memory was authority. Valor sat on his throne. No advisor stood at his right hand. That position remained conspicuously empty, a statement in itself. But when he needed counsel, when decisions required wisdom beyond violence, he would turn to where Melis stood and ask. No command.
Ask.
And sometimes she would answer, and sometimes she would say nothing at all, because the voice of the forbidden served truth, not power, remembering what needed remembering.
Spoke what needed speaking.
And if that made her dangerous to every comfortable lie in the Night Dominion?
Good.
The court session began. Melis listened, remembered, and witnessed. No longer invisible, never owned, just free. And in a kingdom of immortals who'd forgotten what freedom looked like, that made her the most dangerous person in the room. They'd thought she was just a waitress, powerless, invisible, beneath notice. But Melis Corwin had learned the oldest truth of all, that empires aren't saved by fangs or crowns or centuries of accumulated might. They're saved by truth spoken aloud, by courage that trembles but speaks anyway, by the voice that remembers when everyone else has forgotten. And sometimes, just sometimes, that voice belongs to a girl who poured wine and kept her eyes down until the night she raised them and changed everything. And there you have it, the waitress who spoke truth and changed a kingdom. If this story grabbed you by the throat and didn't let go, if you're thinking about Melis and Valor and what it means to choose truth over survival, then do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button if you haven't already, because tomorrow I'm bringing you another story that will haunt you in the best way possible. Drop a comment telling me, what would you do if you inherited forbidden knowledge that could save a king or get you killed? Would you speak? Or would you stay silent? I want to know. And if you love this journey into the Night Dominion, share it with someone who needs a story about courage that trembles but speaks anyway. Until tomorrow, remember, sometimes the most dangerous weapon isn't a blade or a fong. It's the truth spoken aloud when silence would be safer. I'll see you in the next story.